It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Sal Mercogliano, who, those of you who were listening a little bit earlier, I first met a few years ago at the Kegel Sea Power Symposium, where he talked about North American navies, focusing on the U.S. Navy, and our own Tim Choi talked about the RCN. It was a great session. I found out that Sal has a wealth of knowledge, and that comes from his background. He's the Associate Professor of History at Campbell College in North Carolina. He's an adjunct professor at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, which is the probably lesser known of the U.S. service academies. He holds a Bachelor in Science in Marine Transportation from the State University of New York, a Master's of Marine History and Nautical Archaeology from East Carolina, and a PhD in Military and Naval History from the University of Alabama. He's obviously stuck to the rule that you don't do all 3 degrees in one place. He's also a Merchant Marine Deck Officer with a license for unlimited tonnage, a second mate. And he was just telling us a few minutes ago he had been the third mate on the USNS Comfort, the hospital ship. Those of you who follow maritime affairs on Twitter will find him there frequently. And he also has an excellent YouTube channel, What's Going On with Shipping. And I tell you, I don't know, Sal, how you have the time to do what you do, but it's an amazing body of work, and we're very glad to have you here. So just a second, I will turn you into the presenter so that you can put your slides up, and we can get on with the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sal Mercogliano.
Well, I want to first off thank Barry and everybody at the association for the invite to be here today. It's a really great honor, and I have to just say just a couple of quick words here as I get my slides up here for you. I have a long connection with the Royal Canadian Navy. As was mentioned, I was third mate on the hospital ship Comfort. So I spent a long time in the Persian Gulf in 1990 and 91 with Athabascan, Terra Nova, and Protector alongside of me. So I appreciate all the protection you gave my big unarmed hospital ship in the Persian Gulf at the time. I have been on Twitter for a long time, but I think one of the best follows I ever have is the Royal Canadian Navy. I'm very proud of that because I can't get the U.S. Navy to follow me, but I can get the Royal Canadian Navy to follow me. So that to me is a great great feeling for me. What I want to talk about tonight with you is an article I'm actually working on right now for the U.S. Naval Institute for their upcoming history essay contest. And I modified it a little bit to fit the audience here. And what I want to talk about tonight is the crucial role that oilers play early in the war in the Pacific and how essential they were not just to support naval operations, but to support long range expeditionary warfare across the length of the Pacific. As you know, Operation Projection is ongoing. You've just seen the sortie from Halifax of Montreal in Asterix. You've just seen 2 vessels come back in from a deployment, and over in the Pacific side, you had Winnipeg and I believe it was I forget which one now, Vancouver, come back in after 5 months in December. And so, one of the things that the RCN is doing extremely well, as it always does, is range across the globe. And one of the things that has been really brought to my attention more in doing my research, my doctoral dissertation was on the role of commercial shipping in national defense for the United States from the Spanish American War forward, is how crucial logistics are for naval expeditions, especially when you can get shut out of communities and towns and find yourself isolated in an area where logistics is all that you bring with you. And if you didn't bring anything with you, you're in a bit of a trouble. And so, what I really want to do is what can the RCN learn from the experiences of the U.S. Navy early in World War II? And let me be clear, this is an allied operation. We were working alongside with the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal New Zealand Navy, and the Royal Navy in this operation. So I think the RCN, which will play a vital role later on in the conflict in this area, still has a lot that they can pull from this And so one of the things that's very apparent here is if you look early in World War II, the US Navy is roughly the size it was today. If you look in 1940, it's running about 340 ships and about 120 auxiliary ships. Today, the US Navy, maybe 260 combatants or 240 combatants and about 60 auxiliaries. So smaller than it was, but still a major operation. And when you look at the war in the Pacific, what most people will identify when they look at World War II in the Pacific for the US Navy early in the war is the role of the six carriers built that became the centerpieces of carrier task forces. You know, Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet, Lexington, Saratoga, and Wasp. And I want you to get out of the mindset of the carrier task forces, but think more about task forces, fast task forces. How do you support an expeditionary task force overseas? Because while I've read, Ian Tolle's book and James Hornfisher's books about this, the thing that struck me the most, and the title of my article is a play on Ian Tolle's very famous book in the U.S. Navy on the six frigates, the very first six frigates built by the U.S. Navy. My take on this is the six Oilers. The six Oilers that the U.S. Navy had at the beginning of World War II that eventually wind up in the Pacific that are absolutely essential for not just sustaining the fast carrier task forces, but also for putting fuel ashore. And these six Oilers really play a role that's kind of unheralded. I like to talk about the roles of merchant mariners. I like to talk about the role of auxiliary vessels. The carriers get enough people writing about them. Aviators and carriers get all the attention they need. They don't need any more from me. But what was missing behind the scenes is the role of how these task forces are supported. And these six ships, specifically the Neosho, the Plot, the Sabine, the Cimarron, the Kaskaskia, and the Guadalupe, all named for rivers in the United States. That's how we used to name oilers. Now we name after very famous political people, depending on which political party is in office. But back then we named them after rivers, very, very arbitrary. These ships were the product of a commercial shipbuilding act, the Merchant Marine Act of 1936. And this is a key element that even the US Navy fails to appreciate is that the shipbuilding program that gets you the Navy of World War II for the United States, the two Ocean Navy Acts of 1937 and 1940, all of them were built on the base of commercial shipping. And without a commercial building infrastructure, it's very difficult to build a naval infrastructure. I think that's one of the clear elements. And these six ships were actually part of a class of 12. Six of them will serve in the Pacific, two in the Atlantic, and four of them are actually converted into escort carriers. They're the four escort carriers of the Saigamon class. But these 12 ships were all built as part of a program, part of a 500 ship building program that was supposed to take 10 years to produce. These were actually hulls number 2 through 13. So they're being built very early in the program. And these ships featured a couple of key things: high speed, 18 to 20 knots, a large tank capacity compared to previous oilers, about 147,000 barrels. A barrel is about 42 gallons of fuel. And they were being built for commercial shipping firms, Standard Oil, modern day Exxon, and Keystone Shipping. And the idea was the U.S. basically provided money to the shipbuilders to ensure that these vessels had these national defense features: twin screw, increased horsepower, capacity for armament on board, additional crew, provisions for underway refueling rigs. And this way, when they were operated commercially, they can be used. We would provide an offset to offset the higher cost because you're burning more fuel because these ships have two engines. And we would basically have these vessels to call upon. Almost immediately upon their construction, several of the vessels were grabbed by the U.S. Navy. And with a very short period of time prior to U.S. entry into the war in the Pacific, all 12 are brought into the U.S. Navy. And at the time of December 7th, 1941, four of the 12 are in the Pacific. One of them, USS Neosho, is actually pictured in that picture in the upper left there. She is actually sitting there straddling Battleship Row. uh, sandwiched between the California and with the Maryland and Oklahoma astern of her. Amazingly, she is not struck by a torpedo during the initial first wave. California in front takes 2. Oklahoma takes between 7 and 9. But Neosho doesn't take anything. She is fully loaded at that moment, too. She had just pumped off aviation fuel to Ford Island. Right after the first wave, she will back out of her slip, cut her mooring lines, back out of the slip, and actually sail past the Navy Yard and dock at Mary Point. That is the area just below the big fuel farm that's there in Pearl Harbor. And in Pearl Harbor at the time, there were tanks for 4.1 million gallons, 4.1 million barrels of fuel. There were 17 large tanks on the hill above Mary Point. Each of those 17 tanks could hold the capacity, each tank individually could hold the capacity of one of these fast oilers. And so there was a massive storage facility. One of the things I'm trying to research right now is find out how much fuel was actually in that facility the morning of the attack. Now, this program builds off the existing commercial merchant marine. I talk about this when I talk about the U.S. merchant marine, how the U.S. merchant marine has really declined over the years. It's now sits in 21st place. I have to say, I pulled up the statistics for the Canadian merchant marine, and it's one of the few times I feel not as bad about the American merchant marine. Sorry to say that. But 3.3 million deadweight tons, 691 ships in the Canadian merchant marine. That's an average of about 4,000 deadweight tons. When you look at the fleet, the Canadian merchant marine represents 0.16 of the world's merchant fleet, and in terms of shipbuilding, it's less than 0.01%. So obviously, that is a big hindrance in the creation of a program where you can take commercial vessels and convert them into military vessels. When you look at the capacity to do underway replenishment, one of the things I always love to talk about is one of the misconceptions of underway replenishment. Knowing this audience that I do, probably one or two of you have been involved in an underway replenishment at one time or another. And one of the things that is really interesting to find out is how underway replenishment was done prior to the way we do it today. So this image you see here and this photograph comes from one of the earliest underway replenishments in wartime. This is the refueling of the first division of American destroyers that used underway replenishment across the Atlantic. In May of 1917, a month after the U.S. enters World War I, we start dispatching U.S. destroyers to Queenstown, modern day Cobh, in the southern shore of Ireland. The first 3 destroyer divisions, each 6 destroyers, are of our 1,000-ton class. They have the ability to steam across the Atlantic, the range, at a cruising speed. However, the 4th division that goes across, led by a Lieutenant Commander Patterson, by Lieutenant Commander John Newton on the Patterson. John Newton on the Patterson has to conduct an underway replenishment. He sails from St. John's, Newfoundland, heading across. He's in a class of destroyers that were nicknamed in the U.S. Navy the Flivvers. Flivvers was a nickname for Model T Fords. And the reason the Flivvers got their name was 26 of them were built. It was the most numerous class of destroyers in the U.S. Navy at the time. And the 740 ton vessels didn't have the range to get across. But Rear Admiral Albert Gleaves, who becomes the commander of the destroyer, he's commander of destroyers for the U.S. fleet. Later on, he's the head of the cruiser transport force. In the years prior to 1917, had developed a program to conduct underway replenishment and really perfected it. David Coonan over at the U.S. Navy War College has done a great program on looking at this development. So this program right here shows you how they conducted an underway replenishment. So one of the things you should get from this image, number one, is how close these ships are together. The average steaming distance at the time was 50 feet. It's not the 120 to 160 feet you see in modern underway replenishment. The other aspect here that is really important is that you see the vessels literally tied together. There is, and it's kind of hard to see in this image, but there are two lines up here on the bow. One of them is actually a large 10-inch towing hawser, which is actually wrapped around the gun turret, and you actually tow the destroyer alongside the oiler. And then there are two 6-inch breast lines that run across the destroyer so that the destroyer basically can be towed and then with a little bit of right rudder keep its distance out because of the close distance. And the reason you had to get so close is because you had to hang the oil rigs off a vessel boom. You had to hang it off the boom. The vessel pictured here is USS Maumee. And Maumee is the second oiler ever built for the U.S. Navy. Technically, she's fuel ship number 14, I believe it is. And she's the second oiler ever built. Very unique vessel, outfitted with diesel engines. The first vessel in the U.S. Navy fitted with diesel engines. And to oversee those engines, they brought on board a expert in diesel engines in the U.S. Navy. This was a young lieutenant who had gone over to Germany before the war to go study at the Mann plant on diesel engines. So this young lieutenant is Chester Nimitz. And so Nimitz is the ship's executive officer and engineering officer. And that day he is running the deck for the underway replenishment. So on board Maumee is Chester Nimitz. On board Patterson is John Newton. And they're conducting this underway replenishment. And it's very successful. In 10 and a half hours, they refuel 6 destroyers, pump over 96,000 gallons of fuel. And up until December of 1917, the U.S. will station mid-Atlantic a oiler to refuel convoys and U.S. Navy ships. They eventually end having the mid-Atlantic oiler there because they don't need it anymore because oilers or tankers are heading across with convoys and there's not as many destroyers crossing the Atlantic. You're doing more destroyer ops in the Western Atlantic. Interesting enough, while Nimitz will become commander of Pacific Fleet and commander of Pacific Ocean areas, John Newton on the Patterson, he becomes Nimitz's deputy during World War II. So both of these men have a great appreciation for underway replenishment, and you'll see how that plays out here. During the interwar years, the U.S. Navy builds a series of oilers, very small with limited capacity. Really, they're in two groups. There are the oilers of ships like the Maumee, what's known as the Kanawha class. These oilers have a speed of about 14 knots and can carry about 55,000 barrels of oil. And then there was a smaller group of a series of classes, the Patoka and the Kanawha, the Callaway class, and they were even slower, 10 and a half knots, and could carry between 50 to 70,000 barrels of fuel. So we had built basically oilers for two purposes. One was to carry oil across the ocean and refuel vessels in port. So basically, they were tankers, no different than commercial tankers. But then we gave them a submission to be able to provide underway replenishment for short-legged destroyers. That was it. The larger vessels, the cruisers, the dreadnoughts, the armored cruisers, did not need them because they could cross the Atlantic. That wasn't really an issue. We really didn't see a requirement necessary for that. And so the U.S. Navy developed a program for that. That all changes once the U.S. realizes that the looming threat emerging is a Pacific threat. And the Pacific changes everything. The Pacific changes the mindset of everyone because now, during the interwar years, the U.S. Navy conducts a series of what's called fleet problems. These are exercises that begin in the early 1920s, go all the way up until the late 1930s, where the U.S. battle fleet fights the U.S. scouting fleet. And one of the problems that emerges very quickly is fuel for larger vessels in the Pacific. As larger vessels are ranging across the Pacific, the realization is these vessels do not have enough fuel, even cruisers. So, for example, there's a fleet problem exercise where the Saratoga, one of the new aircraft carriers that's built on the hull of a battle cruiser, will head toward Panama to launch an air attack. The problem is that all its escorts run out of fuel. The destroyers run out of fuel, and even the cruisers run out of fuel. And there's a point where Saratoga has to run in by itself to launch the attack. And so the decision is made to start modifying vessels to refuel larger ships. And the image you see above is of Bravos. Bravos was one of the sister ship to Mommy, and here she is refueling USS Yorktown. Now, if you've ever done an underway replenishment, and I have done hundreds of them, the distance between those two ships should give everybody pause for how tight and close they are. But that was the distance that was customary during this period of time, about a 50-foot distance, and you're steaming at a speed of about 5 to 8 knots, so not very fast. And you'll see that the distance is really geared by the fact that you're flying the rigs off booms from the oilers. So there's not a lot of distance. You don't want those oil hoses trailing in the water because they'll break and pop. You need to get close enough to do this. And the situation is such that really what we're seeing is a big difficulty in providing the necessary fuel for the fleet. This is one of the reasons why you see the development of the fast oilers, the Cimarron class. These are those 6T3 tankers I talk about. At the very top there, you see Cimarron in its commercial outfit, and then below you see Cimarron as converted into an oiler. Fitted with 5-inch 38 caliber guns, it had almost the equivalent of a destroyer armament in terms of guns. Actually had a director so that you could direct fire with it. It was outfitted with additional space for crew, for radio, and of course, you're outfitted with booms and king posts there so that you can provide underway replenishment while at sea. The aspect that made Cimarron so different than previous oilers was the speed was tremendous, 20 knots, almost twice that of one class of earlier oiler, and the capacity. You're talking about a ship that has nearly twice the speed and almost 2 to 3 times the capacity of the previous oilers. And initially, early in World War II, when Neosho is caught in Pearl Harbor, she is not yet configured to be an underway replenishment vessel. She'll be used as one, but basically, what Neosho is being used for is to fast forward fuel from the west coast of the United States to Pearl Harbor, because one of the things that happened in 1940 and into 1941 was the U.S. fleet was forward deployed. We moved the U.S. fleet from San Pedro Bay, Los Angeles, and Long Beach over to Pearl Harbor. And we had to build the facilities to sustain it. We built the fuel tanks, but just because you have the fuel tanks doesn't mean they're full. And so these vessels were ranging across. And what you see also is the development of this underway replenishment policy. So, for example, a lot of histories, especially U.S. histories of early Pacific War, miss the key aspect that underway replenishment in early World War II is different than later replenishment. So, this is an image of Yorktown refueling just prior to the Battle of Coral Sea. So, this is May of 1942. Yorktown is on the left in the big picture. Neosho is on the right. Neosho will be sunk during the Battle of Coral Sea. The very first ship I ever sailed on was USNS Neosho. It was the third Neosho following this vessel and then a subsequent vessel. A couple of things to note about how things have changed from the refueling from Bravos. Number one, more distance between the vessels. How's that done? They have rigged up on the Yorktown here a boom and pulley system, winches, where basically with these blocks, they can now basically move some of the wires off. Sorry, I was trying to highlight an area here. But you can move some of the wires off, which means you can increase distance between the vessels. And that provided a much big safety margin. In January of 1942, 4 months prior to this image, the USS Kaskaskia, one of the other oilers, was refueling Yorktown via the old method, and they actually slammed into each other. Yorktown weighed about 30,000 tons, Kaskaskia about 25,000 tons, and they were doing anywhere between 8 to 12 knots when they smashed into the side of each other. Kaskaskia lost all its hoses, lost its booms, and couldn't complete the underway replenishment with Yorktown. Matter of fact, had to cancel it. So this is a really big issue to get the safety. The other element here that is absolutely crazy is that bottom right picture where you see the crew of Yorktown absolutely underwater. Just a pure danger of hazard here. One of the things that the oilers were doing were operating pumps and winches from the main deck. Later in the war, the process you see here with the use of the rig will become standard. And more importantly, a new deck is added to the tankers, the oilers, to create a deck above, a spar deck. And on that spar deck, they would work the system. They wouldn't have to be as low as they are here. But this system is really the system that is used. It's one of the reasons why early in World War II, the U.S. is plagued by issues with underway replenishment. Several operations are going to be canceled because of either the inability to underway replenish or the loss of the underway replenishment vessel, which will impact the ability to execute the mission across the Pacific. And in both these cases, I think it's really substantial to realize how key this is. This chart here I got from, of all places, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, which does a fantastic job at putting together information. And I modify it. This was actually 2 slides that I condensed into one. And I'm happy to share my slides with everybody who wants them. And I will forward them over at the end of the broadcast, and you guys can download them and feel free to use them as you like. But one of the things that's missed in early World War II, I would argue, is this. Number one, this chart highlights a key issue of the supply line, of the sea lines of communication, and how important it was. So this image highlights the sea line of communication from Australia to the west coast of North America, United States, all the way up to Canada. And the distances involved here are tremendous. So from Sydney, Australia to Hawaii, it's 4,400 miles. From Sydney to San Diego, it's 6,500 miles. From Sydney to Panama, the Panama Canal, 7,650 miles. And that distance here is absolutely essential to understand. I use this analogy, I use the Falkland Wars of the 1980s to talk about the distances involved in a potential conflict between the US and Taiwan, for example. That's the distances you're looking here. And sustaining this is an extreme problem. When the Arcadia Conference takes place in Canada in December of 1941, there's a couple of key decisions that come out of Arcadia. One of the first is for the United States is the priority to defend this triangle that's depicted here between Midway, Hawaii, and Johnston Island. That's the base of U.S. Pacific operations. We need to defend that area. That area is essential, is not just because it's a forward base for the U.S. Navy, but it has repair facilities. It has the 4.1 million barrels of fuel that the U.S. has prepositioned and created there, which were not attacked by the Japanese in a third wave. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. The second mission given to the U.S. and its allies is we have to keep Australia in the war. It's sometimes forgotten that Australia is severed from its western supply line. When the Japanese make the move into the Southeast Asia, when they take Hong Kong, when they take Singapore, when they take the Dutch and British East Indies, that puts them athwart of the supply line that runs from the Straits of Hormuz, from the Red Sea, and to a lesser extent from the Cape of Good Hope to the west coast of Australia. But in April of 19, there's a series of raids that the Japanese conduct long after December 7th. You have the raid on Darwin in February of 1942. You have the raids in the Dutch East Indies in March of 42. But then in April of 42, you have the raid into the Indian Ocean. And the raid into the Indian Ocean doesn't get the attention it ever needs, but it really should. It forces the Royal Navy to pull out of the Indian Ocean, to fall back on the east coast of Africa. It endangers the supply line coming out of the Persian Gulf in India to Australia. And the decision is made is that, the Allies are going to have to supply Australia via the eastern supply route. across that long sea line of communication. Well, the problem with that sea line of communication is that is at the forefront of the Japanese advance. The Japanese strike and hit Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, but they're making moves down into the Bismarcks and toward New Guinea in February and March of 1942. You remember the Japanese plan was in May of 1942, seize Port Moresby, seize Tulagi and the Solomon Islands. In June of 1942, grab the Aleutians, grab Midway Island, and then in July of 1942, grab New Caledonia, grab Fiji, grab Samoa. Now, that doesn't sever the supply line to Australia, it just makes it even longer. And the idea here was to put Australia in a position where its eastern and western supply lines are so extended, it will not be able to sustain itself and would have to negotiate out a peace treaty. Now, one of the things the United States has to do is deal with the shipment of goods to Australia, not just militarily, but civilian. You've got to keep the Australians supplied and New Zealand to keep in the war. And the problem was fuel was going to be an issue in Australia. Australia was getting its oil from the British East Indies, from the Persian Gulf. It's not getting it anymore from there. And so the US is going to have to haul oil to Australia. And that means that ships are not going to be able to fuel anymore in Australia. So one of the very first things the United States does is down here. It's not even listed on the map here, but it's right above this box in the lower right corner. Near Tahiti, on the island of Bora Bora, the United States initiates an operation called Bobcat, where they establish a fueling base. They're going to put ashore tanks for 200,000 barrels of fuel. But before then, to keep the ships fueled going to and from Australia and New Zealand, they take several of their oilers, the smaller ones, and place them there as station tankers. So Ramapo, Sepgula, and a few other ones will rotate in there and provide that. You will also see a Royal Fleet Auxiliary vessel, the Bishopdale, come in there to provide oil for forces coming from the Royal Navy. Warspite coming out of Puget Sound, for example, will refuel there. Aquitania, which is coming out of Australia heading toward the U.S. to pick up troops, will refuel there. And so this becomes a really important area for this operation. And what I want to do is just in the time I got left here and still have time for questions is just highlight a couple of examples from early operations. My article I'm writing really goes in more detail about this, but I just want to highlight a couple of things that happened here. So one of the first operations undertaken by the U.S. in the Pacific War is the relief of Wake Island. And my analogy of this is what happens in a peer-to-peer conflict with China, with Guam, and I see very much a similar scenario here. The U.S. will have to relieve Wake Island early in the war. The USS Enterprise and its task force is late getting into Pearl Harbor. I'm always interested in how critical historians are of U.S. naval operations early in the war. When Enterprise is coming back from Wake Island, it sailed to Wake Island to drop off a squadron of Marine fighters, Grumman F-4Fs. And on the way back, it has to refuel. It doesn't have a oiler with it. So on the way to Wake Island, the carrier and the three heavy cruisers refuel the destroyers. On the way back, they got to refuel them again, but they're unable to refuel them because of bad weather on December 5th. So on December 6th, they have to wait a little bit longer. They fuel half the destroyers and they got to fuel the other half the morning of December 7th. So they're running behind. But that task force sailing to and from Wake Island really demonstrates the fuel issues. When Enterprise pulls back into Pearl Harbor on December 8th, it has 50% fuel left. The three heavy cruisers have 30% fuel left, and the 9 destroyers have 20% fuel left. I know a lot of ship commanders, and the idea of getting your fuel gauges down to 20% would drive them crazy. It would be, first off, way below op specs, but it would be a major problem. Interestingly enough, the U.S. tries a relief operation to go out there. The Lexington, which is out delivering dive bombers to Midway, is tasked to go do this. The commander of the Lexington task force is now Rear Admiral John Newton, the same lieutenant commander who brought those first destroyers across. John Newton is the commander of this task force. Neosho comes out to refuel him, and he can't refuel from her. The weather's too bad. Neosho doesn't have the experience, have never done it before. They don't have the proper equipment on board, and on 3 separate days, they try to refuel, and it's unsuccessful. And so Lexington has to go in. They eventually put an expedition together to go there with Admiral Fletcher on board Saratoga, but he has to take the old oiler with him, the Neches. But Neches is the most well-trained oiler in the fleet. This is the oiler that had worked all the Pacific Fleet exercises, had the best training. But because of weather and the fact that Fletcher wanted to fuel at the last minute before heading toward Wake, because he'd heard that Japanese carriers were in the area, he waits until the last moment. Well, he's trying to refuel in December in the North Pacific, in a period of time when it's late December. It's the shortest days of the year. No one has done night refueling before. And now what he finds is he can only fuel half his destroyers on one day, half another day. It slows him up because of the speed and the distance involved. And so he misses his opportunity to relieve the Wake Island command, and Wake Island falls, all for the want of an oiler. You have the early carrier raids. These are the operations undertaken by U.S. carriers. Now, I differ on how a lot of people interpret these carrier raids. Some say this is just, just little tiny small hits against the Japanese to distract them. I think this is a very important operation because this is being done to blunt the Japanese offensive toward that supply chain, and most importantly, to disrupt their logistics. In particularly, they want to disrupt the Japanese submarine force because the Japanese, most people fail to understand Japanese submarine operations in World War II. Japanese submarines are the vanguard for any fleet operation. Anytime we see the I boats go, that's the vanguard of the fleet, and then they cover the withdrawal. So early in World War II, where do we see the I boats? We see them off Hawaii, we see them astride the supply line, and we see them off the west coast of the United States and Canada. And they do inflict losses. We see losses of ships. And in particularly, one of the ships that sunk is that oiler, the Neches. The old oiler was coming out to refuel the Lexington as Lexington was heading back to Wake Island for a carrier raid. But the Neches is sunk because it's unescorted, because, again, you have a limited number of escorts. And it's better to put your escorts on your carrier than your auxiliary. But what the Japanese learned very quickly is that those oilers were prime ripe targets. Matter of fact, one of the things we see happen in December of 1941 is that the U.S. Navy holds commercial vessels in Hawaii until about December 17th. Then they let them go. They escort them out, and then they disperse. 3 of the 6 ships that sail on December 17th are sunk by the Japanese. 2 by Japanese I boats, 1 by 2 auxiliary cruisers that are operating in the Pacific east of the west coast of the United States, between the west coast of the United States and the Panama Canal. And they are able to sink those vessels. But the early carrier raids are really marked by the attachment of the fast carriers to the early carrier raids. So when you see Yorktown and Enterprise and Lexington, and all these vessels go to do carrier raids at places like the Gilberts and the Marshalls and Ley and Rabaul. They all have a fast carrier with them. The Battle of Coral Sea. So one of the most interesting things I found in my research was an assessment done by Admiral Nimitz and his staff on the Battle of Coral Sea. And understand, the plan for the Battle of Coral Sea wasn't just to have 2 carrier task force there. It was to have all 4. It was to have the Lexington, the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and Hornet down there. Saratoga had gotten hit by a submarine torpedo, was out of action, was up at Puget Sound. But he had planned to have all 4 carriers there. And I just want to read you a statistic that he had in there. He estimated to have the 4 carrier task forces operating in the South Pacific would require 370,000 barrels of fuel per month. Now, a fast oiler carried about 150,000 barrels. But that's at normal steaming. That's at normal 15 knots cruising. Under flight conditions, under wartime conditions, that number triples. And what he estimated was he would need at least 450,000 tons, 450,000 barrels a month, along with 120,000 barrels a month delivered by commercial oilers. His assessment said, I will need 8 oilers, 5 fast oilers, 3 of the slower ones, and 2 commercial tankers. And even then, I can only sustain operations in the South Pacific until May. And what that meant was the U.S., for a limited period of time, could operate their 4 task forces in the South Pacific. But after that point, they would have to leave. The thing that alleviated this all was sinking of Lexington, and which alleviated the fuel situation. But then the Japanese got the Neosho, and that required a different element. The Battle of Midway saw the use of all 5 of the remaining fleet oilers. 3 of them were attached to the fast carriers. 1 went to the Aleutians with the task force, and 1 was in standby at Pearl Harbor to respond. I think it's interesting to note, because this statistic has never shown, that while the U.S. will sail 5 oilers, the Japanese sail 18. And one of the things that's happening here is the Japanese are running out of oil. This is one of the last times you'll see the Imperial fleet sail in its mass. And the reason isn't because they want to stop doing it, it's because they're running out of fuel. And more importantly, they have a finite number of tankers. And those tankers have got to get flowing oil from the Dutch and British East Indies up to Japan. And then the last element here is the Guadalcanal campaign. And this, very similar to Coral Sea, has a study associated with it. So they're going to send these 2 massive task forces, a carrier task force of 3 carriers, and then an amphibious task force. And Admiral Gormley, who's commander of Southern Pacific, says, I'm going to need, and this is his estimate, that he's going to need 850,000 barrels of oil a month. He's going to get that from 3 fast oilers that are sailing with the carrier task forces, the 3 carriers. He wants 3 with them. He wants 2 fast oilers on the West Coast to expedite delivery of oil from the West Coast, deliver it to the task forces, relieve the oilers with the task force so they can go back to the West Coast. And then he wants at least 2 commercial tankers providing him with oil. And one of the reasons why the U.S. carriers have to pull out from the Battle of Guadalcanal after the landings is because, number one, while they had sufficient oil on hand, they did not have sufficient coordination to ensure all the ships were fueled on time. And there's a kind of a pea under the eggshell thing where they just couldn't get the right oilers to the right place. And when the ships arrived off Guadalcanal, they were already low on fuel. And matter of fact, one of the things that's eventually happened is Admiral Gormley requires that for the 3 carrier task forces, that instead of pulling all 3 back at the same time, to rotate 1 back from the 3. And that's how the Wasp will miss the Battle of Eastern Solomons. But there's an interesting development here. In September of 42, the first new oilers arrive out in the Pacific. These are commercial oilers taken up from trade and converted over to the Navy mission. They're not fast oilers. They're T2 tankers. They're slower, but they're the first replacement oilers. The other element here is that in September of 42, Admiral Nimitz requires all commercial tankers. He has about 25 commercial tankers that are assigned to him, delivering oil from the West Coast and the Caribbean to the Pacific. All of them be outfitted so that they can take underway replenishment rigs. So in other words, the oilers can fly a rig to them and pump out their oil so that they don't have to go into port, what's called a consolidation operation or a console. And that kind of brings us back to where I wanted to get to here at the very end. The situation that we see today across the Pacific. One of the things that stands out is these vast distances. This is from a entity called CSBA. This is a kind of a think tank in Washington, D.C., that looks at logistics issues for the United States. And one of the things they identified is a big flaw in the U.S. Navy, in that the U.S. Navy became very used to doing logistics close to bases. whether it's Korea from Japan in 1950s, whether it's Vietnam to Subic Bay in the Philippines, 1960s to 1970s, whether it's the Persian Gulf to Bahrain and Oman in the 1990s and 2000s, but a potential conflict peer to peer against Russia across the Atlantic or China across the Pacific really highlights the issues here. When U.S. Navy destroyers were built uh, prior to World War II, when we built the first new generation of destroyers, one of the requirements was they had to have a range of at least 5,000 nautical miles. And that was to deal with the Pacific. Today, a Burke class destroyer, this is unclassified, I pulled it off the internet, has a range of about 4,400 miles. You'll see that doesn't get them round trip from San Diego to California. That doesn't even get them across the Pacific without having to stop. This where Halifax class frigates make such a big difference in their range, almost double that of what the Burkes have. It's why the reduction in range you get from the Type 26s, I think, are really significant. If you look at a typical Type 26, you're talking about 7,000 versus 9,500 miles. And when you start playing Pacific scenarios, this all plays in. Uh, One of the things that the U.S. Navy had as an advantage was a huge fueling facility in the Pacific. The third wave of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nagumo didn't launch it from the Kido Butai. Well, the U.S. Navy has launched its own third wave in closing the Red Hill facility. 6.5 million barrels of fuel is no longer there. Guam is within the missile envelope of the Chinese. So are bases in Japan and Korea. And what happens if you have to stage forces across a large ocean, whether the Pacific or even as far as the Indian Ocean, without the support you need? One of the things that happened in 1898 during the Spanish American War, when the U.S. Asiatic Squadron was kicked out of Hong Kong because of declaring war against Spain, is Admiral Dewey had to buy two commercial vessels quickly and load them to the gunnels with coal so that he would have fuel, because he could no longer count on fuel from neutral nations. And until the U.S. developed a coaling series of stations across the Pacific, at Pearl Harbor, at Guam, and then through the Mediterranean, through Gibraltar, Malta, Suez, Aden, Singapore, there, the U.S. Navy found itself really counting down the amount of coal it had until supplies arrived. And I think that is where I'll end. I went a little bit over. I apologize, but I want to leave time for questions. So thank you for the opportunity to present on this. And I look forward to your questions.